Hi, thank you for joining me. What you're about to watch is a recording of a presentation that I gave at the Bryce Canyon Utah Prairie Dog Day Annual Festival on June 13, 2004. My name is Nikki Fry, and I've worked for the Utah Prairie Dog Recovery Program on writing the recovery plan, and now work on the Recovery Implementation Team's Technical Committee. I've also helped create Utah Prairie Dog Habitat Credit Exchange Program, a program to help landowners with Utah prairie dogs on their lands. I had the pleasure of studying Utah prairie dogs a few years ago to improve relocation success from urban landscapes to rangelands, and watching them has secured my belief that they are truly a unique and important species in the environment. My objective for this talk is to have you agree with me by the end of the talk. Utah prairie dogs are part of the squirrel family. There's actually 5 species of prairie dogs, including our Utah prairie dog, which is Cynomys parvidens. The big green blob right here is actually a black-tailed prairie dog, and this is the prairie dog that most people are familiar with. It's what most pictures are of, and it's the source of most of the public's animosity towards prairie dogs. They do exist in large, very populated colonies that spread across the landscape. In contrast to that, we have 4 species of what are considered white-tailed prairie dogs. This orange blob is actually the species white-tailed prairie dog. We also have Gunnison's prairie dog in the Four Corners area, and we have a remnant population of Mexican prairie dog, and then finally in southern Utah, we have our Utah prairie dog. For a little zoom up of that, here you can see the state of Utah. Utah prairie dogs only exist in the state of Utah. They're located in several counties that you can see on this map. In southern Utah, they're often confused with ground squirrels because the juvenile prairie dogs are about the same size as ground squirrels. And here you can see on your right-hand side of your screen, this would be an adult prairie dog, and on the right is the adult Wyoming ground squirrel. Now the adult Utah prairie dog is between 14 and 17 inches tall, and the adult Wyoming ground squirrel is a little bit smaller, between 10 and 12 inches tall. So a juvenile Utah prairie dog would actually be similar in size to the Wyoming ground squirrel. And you can see they look nearly identical. There is a different color to their fur, and like I said, the Utah prairie dog is just a little bit taller. But in the field, a novice person that's not used to working with prairie dogs might get those confused. Compared to other small mammals, Utah prairie dogs have small litters. They have 3 to 4 offspring per year. In contrast, the Wyoming ground squirrel has up to 10 offspring per year. They're short-lived species, so their strategy is to give birth to lots of offspring over the course of their life, and then those offspring have a high mortality rate, meaning that most of the offspring aren't going to live through their first winter. And compare that to a long-lived species like human beings, where we have 1 or 2 offspring, up maybe 6 total, but we have a low juvenile mortality rate. Just like other prairie dog species, Utah prairie dogs are very social animals. The populations can be broken down into 3 basic elements: coteries, wards, and towns, although each of these isn't always present and doesn't have to be present to constitute what we call a colony. A coterie, and in this example there are 13, a coterie is a male and his associated females, and possibly the juvenile offspring of those females. Excuse me. A ward is a semblance of coteries where there's a geological obstruction that excludes everyday interchange, but they still interact. So in this example, we have 2 wards. And what we consider a colony are these small assemblies of several coteries. So the coterie is the small family group. A colony is a grouping of those coteries. A ward would be several colonies within the landscape that are obstructed in some way from other colonies. So in this case, we have 2 wards. And then the entire population on the landscape is called the town. That's the whole grouping. So in this example, we have, in this example we have 13 coteries, 5 colonies, 2 wards, and a total of 65 individuals. 45 of these individuals are juveniles, which have about a 50% chance of survival. This is actually a very unrealistic diagram. It's just shown for your education. This would be an example of a very healthy Utah prairie dog town. Usually, if we have prairie dog towns with 20 adult prairie dogs in them, we're pretty happy. It's more than likely that we have colonies with 10 adult prairie dogs in them. Within these towns, the females are in charge. So within each one of these, the females are in charge. The lives center around the eldest female in the coterie. So grandma's in charge, and everybody listens to grandma. And let's face it, we can pretty much, relate to that. The goal of the Utah prairie dog is to get fat enough to hibernate through the lean winter months. And when I say hibernate, I mean that they do go underground when winter weather starts, but it's not like the hibernation of a grizzly bear. Utah prairie dogs do get up and forage if there are warm days in the wintertime, and then they go back underground. So it's more of a torpor where their metabolism slows down and they are sleepy, but they can reinvigorate themselves and come above ground if there's some nice warm winter days so that they can get some foraging in. Additionally, they love a good siesta. During the summer, Utah prairie dogs will avoid the heat by going underground in the afternoon. So they're active in the morning, generally around 1 or 2 when it gets really hot. They'll go underground and then come out in the evening for a quick bite to eat before nighttime. Their smaller reproduction compared to other squirrels and the high rate of mortality with their juveniles makes it very, very difficult to reestablish Utah prairie dog populations should a mortality event occur, like a habitat damage or construction of a new community, etc. So these low populations can become fragmented in the habitats around southern Utah, and they're difficult to regrow. Complicating the issue of trying to regrow this threatened species, humans have a long history of conflict with prairie dogs. Before we realized that there are different species than the black-tailed prairie dogs, those prairie dogs that grew in large, expansive colonies, we actually had a federal program to kill them to help out the farmers in the area. And so we did a really great job. Population numbers were extremely low, and then we realized that they were a different species and that we were pushing them to extinction. So they became an endangered species in the 1970s, and they were downlisted to a threatened species in the mid-1980s. And they remain a threatened species today. There are some valid reasons for conflicts. Like I said, they do compete with human activities. In general, they like the same loose soil as our farmers. So they like to tunnel underground. They build their colonies underground with very arable soils, things that are easy to dig out. And incidentally, those are the same loose soils that our farmers like for our agricultural efforts. And that soil is very limited in Utah, and especially in southern Utah. It's limited to areas where there used to be large rivers way back in geological time. So we have these very limited loose soil habitats that our farmers like. When Utah prairie dog populations do grow into large colonies, they can compete with cattle for forage on range. There's some data suggests that they live in harmony, and there's some data out there that suggests that they will reduce forage on the range that cattle could use. Again, in southern Utah, where we have a very dry landscape and a very dry rangeland, that little bit of competition is enough to cause some concern for ranchers. Additionally, in areas where we're growing our crops, so we have irrigated agriculture in that arable soils, the prairie dogs actually like what we're growing. They like alfalfa, they like corn, and so they can position themselves on the corners of those pivots and take advantage of that crop. and they can do considerable damage if they're high enough numbers, if they have a very sizable population. And finally, their digging makes holes. So there are cases where farmers and ranchers are concerned for the safety of their livestock because of the holes made by these larger colonies of prairie dogs. They can get in the way of our commercial enterprises. In this situation, you can see Utah prairie dogs and their burrows here at a local golf course. So this is a concern. It's not a safety issue per se, but it's a concern. It could damage the economy of that golf course. Another major reason for conflict is plague. Plague is a non-native disease that was brought over to Europe, and it's made its way eastward across the plains and into Utah. Utah prairie dogs are very susceptible to plague, and so it's very difficult to build prairie dog populations. Once they reach a certain density, that density makes it very easy for the fleas carrying the plague bacteria to get into that population. We're also concerned about plague because of disease transmission to humans. And it's certainly true that Utah prairie dogs could assist in the transmission of plague. If fleas are infected with plague and living on the prairie dogs, and a human walks through that colony and then gets bitten by those infected fleas, there is that chance that the human could contract plague. However, plague kills Utah prairie dogs rather quickly. So one would have to be interacting with Utah prairie dogs at the precise moment that there's an active outbreak. Most of our prairie dogs are remotely located. The chance of that happening is very slim. Now it's possible, it's just very slim. And simple safety precautions like wearing insecticides can virtually eliminate that concern. If you look on our chart on the right, you can see the reported human plague cases from 1970 to 2012. And you can see that we generally have about 5 or less cases of plague in the United States each year. Sometimes we do have these bumps where we have these larger outbreaks in these cases where there's a lot of plague reported. These areas are actually mostly in New Mexico and Arizona. Most of our cases are in New Mexico and Arizona. Rarely is there anything in Utah or Colorado. So while there are conflicts associated with Utah prairie dogs on the landscape, there's actually many reasons to like and maybe even enjoy the Utah prairie dogs. For one, they're kind of cute. Maybe at first glance they look just like a rodent, but if you watch them for 5 minutes, I think you'll agree with me that they can be quite interesting. For one, they're very social animals. Here is a picture of the juveniles interacting with each other, but adults and juveniles alike will groom each other. They greet each other with face touching, with kissing. They actually share babysitting duties within the colony, and they'll share lookouts. So there's a sentinel looking out for danger while others are foraging and others are babysitting. So it's very family-oriented group activity, much like humans, I think. Prairie dogs are actually very good communicators. They actually may be a species with the most complex language compared to in the non-human species. So compared to humans, they may have the next most complex language. They learn their language just like we and other primates learn languages. So a juvenile does not know how to communicate as well as an adult. So they have to learn how to talk, how to communicate just like we do. There's some research out there that suggests that they can actually communicate that it's the white truck that's pulled up in the field, or it's the research biologist that's pulled up in the field versus a hunter. So they know how to communicate danger. They know how to communicate safety. They can also communicate different people, different individuals. So again, it may be the most complex language in a species other than primates and humans. And that's pretty impressive for a 14-inch animal. Probably the most important reason to appreciate the Utah prairie dog is that they're good for the natural environment. They create their environment, which is used by others. Research has shown that the forage within a prairie dog colony or ward or town has higher nutrition. It also keeps out shrubs. They like to be able to eat the grass. They have the grass growing each year. They keep out the shrubs. The shrubs compete for grass, but also the shrubs block their view of predators. They like to be able to see far into the landscape, so they take that shrubs out. So they're key at maintaining a grassy landscape, especially in the higher densities of prairie dog colonies. The way that prairie dogs graze and dig also increases water distribution and water filtration into the community so that we have overall higher plant and animal diversity in and around colonies. About 160 animal species have been recorded using the Utah prairie dogs, their burrows, or the habitat that they create. They create temporary shelters, so shelter from the sun, shelter from the rain, shelter from predators, for a variety of species including pocket mice, kangaroo rats, burrowing owls, toads, snakes, 13-line ground squirrels, Townsend's ground squirrels, beetles, and other insects, and cottontail rabbits. Their burrow systems are used as homes for burrowing owls, rabbits, badgers, ferrets, foxes, snakes, toads, lizards, squirrels, mice, and many, many individual species that I don't need to go on about. You get the picture. Utah prairie dogs are a key element in the high desert landscapes ecosystem. They're definitely an important link in the food web. They are food for badgers. Actually, badgers are the number one problem we have when we're trying to increase Utah prairie dog numbers. Hawks, coyotes, foxes, and eagles. So these predators rely on Utah prairie dogs for some portion of their diet throughout the year. I mentioned that prairie dogs actually maintain a habitat that is used by other species. This grassland landscape habitat can be used by sage sparrows and sage thrashers, pronghorn, and greater sage-grouse. So in summary, I think that we could view the Utah prairie dog as America's meerkat. Everybody knows what meerkats are, how they live. We had Meerkat Manor on cable TV. And, prairie dogs are much like meerkats. They have the same social characteristics. They have very similar life history traits. And I think that if you can get on board with Meerkat Manor, you can get on board with Utah prairie dogs. With all this in mind, I hope that the next time you see a Utah prairie dog, you can stop and look at them with a sense of appreciation. Watching and enjoying the Utah prairie dogs are encouraged. So take time to view Utah prairie dogs while you're in southern Utah, and I hope that you find a way to see them as enjoyable as I do. Thank you very much for your time.